Back in 2016, as Vice President, Joe Biden oversaw what was the launch of the Cancer Moonshot Project. Now in 2022, President Biden announcing the reignition of this moonshot goal with the objective of cutting the cancer death rate in half over the next 25 years, as well as improving the lives of the patients and those survivors. My next guest can speak to the progress that we are making in this space and also the innovations to come. We want to welcome Dr. Dmitrovsky, who is the director of the Frederick National Laboratory for Cancer Research, and he's president of the Leidos Biomedical Research. Doctor, thank you very much for joining us today. And I want to begin with this Moonshot Project. How do we get there over the next 2.5 decades?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you so much for inviting me to take part today. I really appreciate the invitation. And the views that I'm going to express are my personal views as a cancer scientist and cancer doctor, not speaking on behalf of the National Cancer Institute or the Frederick National Laboratory. But let me put in perspective the question that you've asked. When President Kennedy put forth his famous address of the creation of the Apollo moonshot 60 years ago, it's important to recognize that we achieved those goals through public-private partnership. Just think for a moment, only 32 Apollo astronauts went to the moon. Only 12 of them walked on the lunar surface, but over 400,000 scientists, engineers, NASA, military, and staff from the public and private sectors worked together to get them to the moon and back safely. So over the course of my career, I've seen tremendous progress in tackling the cancer problem. Cancer is a scourge that affects nearly every family. Each of us knows someone who has had a cancer diagnosis. And during the last few decades, indeed, when the cancer incidence peaked in 1991 until 2019, the American Cancer Society has reported a 32% decline in that mortality rate. So progress has already been made. In my own career, I've seen stunning progress as a cancer doctor. Indeed, just think over the last few years, we've added a new arm to the armamentarium of tackling the cancer problem, immunotherapy that's been in the news so much. So part of the answer to your question is by putting an emphasis on public-private partnerships. We need not look beyond the example that you've already spoken about with the earlier panel members of the COVID response, that the fastest a vaccine was created before the recent vaccines for COVID occurred over 4 years of time invested, but in less than a year, we were able to bring to market and to patients new vaccines. And this was an example of public-private partnerships where public funds were used to accelerate science and move advances from the bench to the bedside to help patients. So that is an example that I'd like to cite.
I just want to point out Dr. Dmitrovsky has been on the cutting edge of cancer research, including genetic and gene therapy for leukemia. You have been honored for your work, and so we thank you for your expertise on this. Is the goal, though, realistic, 25 years?
Well, if you look, Steve, at the examples I just cited, that from 1991 to 2019, a 32% reduction in cancer death rate. That was before we had the advances that basic science has brought to the fore. New ways of combating cancer, like immunotherapy, but other ways. One of the most daunting and difficult cancer problems have been to try to treat RAS oncoprotein, RAS-causing protein, that is linked to several very, very difficult and challenging cancers to treat. An example is pancreatic cancer, where 95% of pancreatic cancer patients have mutations, alterations of the RAS cancer-causing protein called an oncoprotein, but about a third of lung and a third of colon cancers harbor these mutations. And for 40 years, we've known about these mutations, but just the year before last was the very first drug that successfully targeted a subset RAS causing cancers in lung cancer. So there's been tremendous progress that was made possible through decades of basic science investment that the public funds have used. And this has unleashed opportunities that we didn't have before. And that's why I have hope for the future as a cancer doctor, that I and we will be able to bring new measures to patients who really need innovation in the cancer clinic.
But doctor, let me ask you about that issue of treatment, because as you rightly point out, every one of us, either through family or friends, have known somebody dealing with cancer. For those who undergo the treatment and are lucky enough to survive, do you envision that the treatment in the future will be less painful, less difficult for those patients?
That is the hope, but there's also reality that we can point to, Steve. And I'll give you an example from my own scientific experience. I was involved in a discovery early in my career of a rare but lethal leukemia called acute promyelocytic leukemia, where very harsh measures were used to treat these leukemia sufferers. And even with these very toxic therapies, chemotherapy, sadly, only about a quarter of patients were cured. And my team and others brought to the clinic an FDA-approved treatment for this type of leukemia that was an oral therapy, didn't require IV therapy. And this oral therapy, combined with other measures like the drug arsenic trioxide, has meant that we have an oral regimen, much less toxic and highly effective for so-called good risk acute promyelocytic leukemia patients, and well over 90% of these patients are cured now with an oral therapy, much less toxic, well tolerated. And I think there'll be many examples of this in the future. That would be one that I would cite.
And of course, you know, the question that I'm sure you get often and I hear so often, do you envision at some point we would have a vaccine that would prevent cancer?
Many of us have hoped that there will be ways for us to have less invasive, less toxic measures that could control cancers and even prevent them. And this is an area of active research throughout the country, especially with the promise of immunotherapy. And so I hold high regard the scientists who are working in this field, and suspect over time we will see progress. But it would be very hard for anyone to predict when that day will come.
And based on your work, and we certainly know the numbers speak for themselves, if you don't smoke, your chances of getting cancer are reduced significantly. If you could just explain what you've been doing on the front lines to make sure that you put in these programs that save many lives.
You've cited something very important for the viewers of this panel to know, and that is the health benefits that will accrue from all of us who might be smoking to stop smoking. And that includes the reduction of cancer risk, but also a reduction of risk of respiratory illnesses like chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases and heart disease. So the benefits of not smoking accrue not only in reducing risk of cancer, but the risk of cardiovascular and respiratory diseases. The hope is that we'll have other interventions that will prevent cancers from forming in the first place, or detecting it at such an early stage that the treatments will be less harsh and less difficult for cancer sufferers to tolerate. But the statistics that I gave you, Steve, just a few minutes ago about the reduction of cancer mortality can be attributed, at least in part, to the fact that Americans are smoking less, exposing their family to less tobacco carcinogens as well as themselves. And so I would urge all viewers to know this fact.
Dr. Dmitrovsky, if you land at Boston's Logan Airport, you will see a mural that says, you like your smartphone, you can thank President Kennedy and the moon program, because that public-private partnership that led to the technology that we're now using 60 years later and really don't think anything of it. So I use that example to ask you about the private partnership with the federal government when it comes to cancer research, whether it's vaccines, treatment, and or cures.
I'll give you an example that I'm familiar with in the work that we do at the Frederick National Laboratory. And keep in mind that we are a federally funded research and development center. We use public funds to serve the public interest. And we have many examples of public-private partnership that really relate to your question. I'll give you one example. In a collaboration between another national lab, Lawrence Livermore National Lab, with the University of California, with the biopharmaceutical maker GSK, and the Frederick National Laboratory, and of course, the National Cancer Institute. We have come together using the powerful exascale computing capability of the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory to tackle a very difficult problem in cancer drug development. It takes upwards of 12 years or longer to bring an idea from the lab into the clinic for ultimate FDA approval. Half of that time is spent in what's called preclinical drug discovery, testing whether a drug gets to the target in a cancer cell and has the desired effect, moving that promising target into a small molecule or an antibody that would inactivate or alter the target in the desired way, test in animals, and ultimately show that it has the right pharmacologic properties well before any patient is treated. This time, 6 years or more, has to be reduced so we can get the latest innovation to patients as quick as we can. And so this collaborative team is using artificial intelligence, machine learning, that you've already talked about today, to reduce that time by developing algorithms that will predict whether a promising compound could be made into a drug, whether it will have drug-like properties so that it can be fashioned into the right formulation that can be given to a patient with the right half-life, reduced toxicity. And the hope is to use these powerful tools of artificial intelligence to shorten that time. That's but one example of a public-private partnership that has a clinical endpoint that, if successful, it will shorten the time of drug discovery. And because public funds are used, anything that's learned is shared with other scientists nationally as soon as we can.
And of course, obviously, preventative care saves so much more than being hospitalized. That goes without question. It is so apparent as we have this conversation with you today that you have a lot of enthusiasm about where we're going, the cutting edge in terms of AI and medical technology and research. I'm wondering, what excites you the most? What are you most hopeful about moving forward?
And if you could tell me, you mean in the clinical realm or the scientific realm?
In the terms of the research that you're doing right now on the front lines of biomedicine.
I think that now that we know the intricacies of what makes a cancer form, and as I said before, decades of scientific discoveries have given us newfound insights into how we can alter the cancer microenvironment, the cancer cell itself, its ability to be eradicated by new and powerful immunologic measures. I think we're standing ready to apply what's been learned in multiple areas, Steve, that have the promise of changing the course, the clinical course of patient care. And I have seen progress throughout my career, but it seems to me that that progress is now accelerating.
So if we were having this conversation in, say, perhaps 2045, or 2050? What do you think we'll be talking about?
I think we'll be talking about more specific therapies that target the very cause of what makes a cell become malignant, using less toxic, better tolerated, and even more effective therapies, because we will be targeting the root cause of what drives a cancer to form.
Dr. Ethan Dmitrovsky, he is the director of the Frederick National Laboratory for Cancer Research. Doctor, thank you very much for joining me today. We appreciate all that you're doing, and keep up the great work. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me.